Welcome, everybody, to a new episode with Astrid, your APD, Dietitian with T, no C. And I am very excited because I'm speaking with Cliff Harvey today, which is also a dietitian. And I am somehow super intrigued about his background. So, Cliff, welcome to the show. Tell me a little bit about why you do what you do and how your work bridges that clinical nutrition, physical culture, and holistic health. How did you come to this point to blend these traditionally separate fields into one thing that you do?
Thanks, Astrid. Yeah, really cool to be chatting with you today. It's an interesting start to my sort of entry into the health and fitness space because I hadn't really ever thought when I was younger about getting into, strength training, nutrition, those types of things. I had actually thought that I was going to go on and be a landscape architect and design sort of Zen inspired gardens and things like that. That was my passion when I was a teenager, and I still do bonsai and stuff like that now. But towards the end of my high school career, I guess you call it, the coaches of the first 15. So I'm from New Zealand and rugby's a big sport here. The first 15 is the best team at your high school for rugby. And so it's a pretty big deal in New Zealand. The coaches of the first 15 came to me in my second to last year of high school and said, if you can put on a whole bunch of weight, you'll captain the first 15. If you don't put the weight on, you won't even play because you're too small. So it was a choice between either making the team and captaining or not making the team at all. And so I was passionate about rugby. I really wanted to play in that team and captain it. And so I went to the library because this was back in the 1990s, a long time ago. And I got out, books by Wilmer and Costel on, nutrition and physiology and strength training and all sorts. And basically learned as much as I could in that short time about eating and training for strength and size development. I put on a huge amount of weight, as a lot of us do in those first couple of years of training. I went on to captain that team. And so that, first goal was achieved. But more importantly, it really spurred a passion for how the body works. And so I decided to change course. I went to university to study strength and conditioning and nutrition. Through that, became a nutrition coach. Started out by working even when I was really young, I was only sort of 18, 19 at the time. This is back in the late 1990s. Began within a year or two of leaving university, working with some of our top athletes here in New Zealand, members of our New Zealand Rugby League team, various top rugby players, a whole bunch of top athletes. And so was really involved in the performance, nutrition, and strength training side of things from a very early stage. Then I started getting quite unwell. I got really sick, lost probably 20 odd kilos of weight, was very, emaciated, anemic, and I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And so that changed things a lot for me because I really wanted to learn more about the clinical side of nutrition. But when I approached the universities at the time about going on and doing further study, they were very resistant to any of the more progressive ideas that I was seeing around at the time. So they were very resistant to looking at higher protein diets, very resistant to supplementation. There was very orthodox, old school approach. And that just didn't really work for me. So instead of going on to further study in nutrition, I went way into left field and studied naturopathy and medical herbalism instead. And as much as people would say, well, you kind of went off the rails at that point, I really didn't, because one of the criticisms that my lecturers had of me when I was studying that was that I was too scientific. And I think that's just a crazy thing to say. No one can be too scientific. But it did give me a real appreciation for holism in the true sense of the word, not holism as people take it, which is, wacky alternative stuff. Holism as being the whole person and their whole environment and all of the things that might give them benefits, but it made me really double down on that idea of being a scientist. We can have all these things that might work, and the way that we discover what is most likely to work is through the evidence. And so that sort of put me on a particular path. I, worked for many years as a nutritionist and strength coach before heading back to university and getting my master's and doctorate in nutrition, focusing on really that term that I coined back in the 1990s, which was the carbohydrate appropriate diet, or the carbohydrate appropriate approach to nutrition, which really tries to break down what I see as being the meaningless battle between low carb and high carb. And we can obviously talk a little bit more about that, but that sort of brings me to today. I'm a registered clinical nutritionist and fellow of the Clinical Nutrition Association. I'm a board member of the Sports Nutrition Association and have a lot of sort of input at a governance level to nutrition at this part of the world, at least.
I love all of that. It sounds like you've got a wealth of knowledge that was worth exploring, especially today that I have the opportunity to chat with you. But I want to dig a bit deeper. So, why and what makes you do what you do? Like, truly, like, what is your big motive and big drive for working with the audience and the type of clients you work with now?
That's a really great question because, it's one of the things that I teach a lot with my students and with my mentees is we always need to be going back to our why because it's so critical, right? And I'll frame this in the way of an analogy. After about 7 years of practice, I felt a little bit burnt out. A lot of people get that 7 year itch where they've been doing something for a while and they start to feel a little bit burnt out. So I took a break and went traveling around South America. And my idea was that I would write a book about nutrition. But the more I thought about it and the more I started to write, the more it became a book. And it's a terrible book. I've taken it off Amazon now because it was, written from a very naive and young place, but it was valuable for me anyway. Because the more I thought about it and the more I began to write, the more I realized that so much of what is important is about why we do it and the choices we make, not so much just the nuts and bolts of nutrition. Because as you know, as a dietitian and most other practitioners, if they're listening in, will know, is that it's not about the plan that's on paper, it's about having people have behavioral change. And the real resting point and the foundation of behavioral change is the why, because that provides for that really evocative sort of stickiness of how people can change. So anyway, when I really started thinking about that, I thought, there are so many things I could do to achieve my why, because my why is quite simple. I believe that the point of life, the objective sort of point of life is to be happy. Now that seems fairly vague, and it is, but there are a lot of elements to that that are far more tangible, like having passion for what we do, for having purpose, for feeling meaning. And when we look at what drives people, and the research is very clear on this, whether they be children, adults in the workplace, sports people, whatever, it's not money and it's not the idea of tangible rewards or punishments. It's feeling like they're part of something greater. So when I realized that, I thought, you know what, this is really important because maybe my burnout was because I'd lost sight of that. My point in doing what I do is to help make people happier. And a big part of what I do is to try and create a society that is happier overall. Now, the way I do it is to help people to eat better, enact, behavioral changes that are going to help with their health, maybe to help them perform at their best if they're an athlete, because those things are all really important to that person's life of passion and purpose. But, if we start to see things in that way, it wouldn't really matter whether I was working in a shop, a retail shop, a coffee shop, whether I was a real estate agent, a lawyer, or a nutritionist. I could probably still achieve that same big why by helping people to achieve their goals and achieve their health and their happiness, because really health and happiness are parts of the same complex.
What does evidence-based or evidence-informed but person-focused nutrition mean to you when you think about the application of it in a world that is always chasing these all size fits all plans? What does this specific mean to you?
Again, another great question, Astrid, because it cuts to the heart of a lot of our challenges within nutrition. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people will think that evidence base, and there's, a lot of evidence bros out there. They think that evidence base means finding the right diet or the right training program or doing, things perfectly according to how they interpret the research. Like if you want to get big, you've got to use loads of volume. And the latest research suggests that there's no real, you know, limit to that. You just try and add more and more volume. And if you're not doing high volume training, you're dumb kind of thing. But what that fails to account for is the incredible inter-individual variability
Mm.
and all of the nuances within it. Like we can't say that someone training on An old Mike Mentzer style one set to failure kind of program is not going to get results because there's plenty of people who do get great results from that. Similarly with nutrition, I've talked about this with my good friend Dr. Eric Helms a lot. And we've spoken at a few conferences where we've made the point that best practice is really important because it tends to be the most appropriate approach for most people most of the time as a general rule. But we're looking at means, we're looking at averages, we're looking at, people within the middle of the bell curve. But as practitioners, we can't just give everyone a cookie cutter best practice approach because it may not work for that person. So we need to start from the idea of best practice, but deviate from it almost immediately when we're working with an individual. In my area, which is really based in that, carbohydrate appropriate idea, one thing that's really frustrating is that, even within the area of low carb, in which a lot of people know me, there almost seems to be a wanton ignorance of the research because people will say, well, if you've got diabetes, just as an example, you should do low carb. Why? Because within 3 to 6 months, it has and I would agree with this, it has the best results in terms of HbA1c and correcting blood markers like your lipids and whatnot. It has probably the best, most rapid results. But then, if a person can't stick to low carb, will they get results from a higher carb diet? Yeah, they will. Assuming that other factors are the same, right? And this is where we need to look at the context of a healthy diet. If someone's getting enough protein, essential fatty acids, essential micronutrients, and their energy intake is appropriate over, say, 12, 24, 36 moments, 12, 24, 36 months, I should say, the difference between any diets tends to narrow and they pretty much become the same. So we really need to be looking at what is going to work for that individual. And so back to your question about evidence married to practice and functional outcomes, we obviously need to be basing everything we do in strong evidence, but we need to modify how we apply that to the lifestyle, habits, behaviors of the individual. So their psychosocial milieu is critically important for what they're going to be able to enact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with this because I see it all the time. You can have the perfect plan written from the books, from the research, the best research, which, by the way, sometimes it just becomes very confusing because the same research, they says something that completely changes when it comes to new research. And then, now the previous information or the previous statements are not right. Now, we can do now something else that is backed by research. But at the end of the day, when we think about application and implementation, adherence at the end of the day is what matters the most for results. You can have the perfect plan. And as you said, you can have a diabetic on a low carb diet, but if they can't adhere to it, they're not going to get they will probably get better results as if they were following just their poor diet and their lifestyle. If they make some changes, if they add extra protein, if they respect the idea of adding more fiber to their nutrition, including more vegetables. But full adherence is not probably going to be there if they can adhere to it. So the expected outcomes by the research is not necessarily going to come to its 100% fulfillment. But we want to always say, well, how as clinicians are we able to adapt something that is unique to that particular person, and we can actually make them adhere to it and feel successful. And also like that feeling of like you can actually stick to something, follow through, and by the end of it, you can actually see results.
Yeah, 100%. And, I spoke about this at the Sports Nutrition Association conference last year because I spoke about coaching and a coaching first philosophy to nutrition practice. Now, I'll take a little bit of a step back because the idea of health coaching is very misunderstood because you have a lot of people out there who call themselves health coaches, but they're not health coaches. They're people without qualifications. They can't call themselves dietitians. They can't call themselves registered clinical nutritionists. And so they say, well, I'm a health coach. But health coaching is actually a distinct thing where it's a method of client-centered practice that is based on behavioral and positive psychology. It's very powerful, and it can be a very powerful standalone, or it can be a very powerful adjunct to existing practice. Because, as you were saying, adherence is the most difficult thing. Anyway, last year at the conference, I spoke about this idea, and I asked the question, at least, that maybe even the terms we use like adherence and compliance are a little bit unwieldy, because even those are casting things from an external motivation standpoint. Adhering to what? Complying with what? Instead, as nutritionists, dietitians, doctors, physios, whatever, we should really be on a journey with the client, helping them to understand how they can forge a path to meet their goals. And so that's going to be a process that involves things like we first did, right? Asking about their why. Like, what is your why? What does that mean to you? Like, what does that mean you're going to try and implement? How are you going to do that? Not us necessarily always telling them, but trying to find out how they're going to do that with our guidance to veer them towards evidence-based, best practice that's going to help them to get there. So really it's about us taking off our superior telling hat and putting on our being with the client hat to help them to really find that approach that's going to work for them. And a big part of that is going to be their psychosocial milieu. The social determinants of health are a big factor. Psychological and emotional determinants of health are a massive factor. And unfortunately, those are often ignored within nutrition practice because people just want to look at the evidence and try and craft the perfect plan for that person. But if that plan is just purely based on physiology and what appears to work best for most people most of the time in RCTs, it's going to be very limited, because we need to step outside of that and look at far more within the person's whole, psychosocial structure as to what they can do and how they're best going to do it.
You said before that health is more than just macros and movement. What other pillars do you think are non-negotiables in your framework for thriving?
Yeah, so I think the foundations are all interrelated. We have sleep, we have stress, we have nutrition and movement. And those are all the foundations by which people can achieve better health. But health is not the end goal, right? Health is part of, because a lot of people nowadays see health as an objectively desirable end goal. So they'll sort of think, I'll ask them, what do you want to do? I want to be healthy. Okay, and we could leave it there, right? We could say, okay, that's cool. I can help you to achieve health. But health is such an abstract thing, and it's often so externally motivated. When people think about health, and I ask people this in workshops and conferences and seminars around the world, they'll often start talking about, oh, well, this person I see on Instagram, they're the idea of health that I want, right? So it's all this externally motivated stuff that's not getting to the heart of their why. When they start to think about their why, what they actually want to be doing, it can take on a whole different context, because then we might say, well, why do you want to be healthy? It's like, oh, well, I've got a sore back and I just feel like I don't have a lot of energy. I'm really fatigued. I've got 2 kids and I want to spend more time with them and spend better quality time. I've got a job I actually like and I want to do better at that because it drives me, it provides some of that purpose. It's like, okay, well, now we're actually starting to get to a better picture of what you really want. It's not health, it's all this other stuff. So with that pathway, we can really start to provide both ends of the spectrum, right? The foundations of health that allow people to achieve health, but then that health is really a pathway to someone's happiness, which is a picture of their passion, purpose, creativity, those types of things. And so I think we need to really be working with people in that more, dare I say it, holistic sense, because it's the only way that we can actually get runs on the board and get people to a point of actually achieving those things. Because as you and I know, the vast majority of people fail in their efforts to be healthy. And I think that's a real function of the framing that's used, and then the interventions that people are basically told to do, versus finding the evocative endpoints and then making those small behavioral changes that can really have impact over time and then can begin to accumulate and aggregate.
I agree with you in the sense that people sometimes don't even really know what health or being healthy means to them until you start digging a little bit deeper into their whys. And what is health for you? What does it mean for you to be healthy? And how can we actually make this happen if we separate these different pillars what we need to work on? What are the areas that are not optimized that we can optimize? So looking at these different pillars, as you mentioned, management of stress, sleep and recovery, movement, and physical activity. I try to separate movement and physical activity because movement is just like being able to move throughout the day, being active somehow without intentionally trying to do more
Yeah.
exercise. Also,
Yeah.
adding that exercise as an additional pillar, and obviously mindset and nutrition. So we can have all these different pillars that when you separate them and try to optimize each one of those is when you actually can make health more tangible and probably more trackable, objective, because then
Yeah.
you can have outcome measures for each one of those pillars and goals that you can focus practically on.
I agree entirely. And I think, health and being healthier is such an intangible for so many people because they haven't really experienced it or they haven't experienced it for a long time. I have told the story many times where I used to quite often ask clients, just as a snapshot, when they first came in, just tell me how you feel generally, like just your immediate impression, 1 to 10, how do you feel? And they'd often say, I'm probably a 6 or a 7, but I feel like I could be a lot more. Right, I really want to optimize my health. Then when they come back in a month or so later, I'd say, well, how do you feel now? And the surprising thing was they would often say, oh, you know what? I think I'm about a 6 or 7. But when I came in before, I wasn't a 6 or 7. I only realize now that I can still achieve more, but I'm feeling so much better. I was probably like a 3 or 4 before, because people get used to feeling a particular way. They get used to feeling tired. They get used to having that, little residual pain through the body and the stiffness and not being able to do those things they want to do with their kids and all those sort of things I alluded to before. And so it's really interesting, as you would know, because you're in, the health space, you live it like many of us do. And, we all make our mistakes and we're all still trying to improve as well. But for so many people, they're not living that and they don't understand just how much better they could feel, how much better life could be. And then the biggest thing I feel happens at that point is it starts to open up possibilities. If people are just getting by all the time, then they feel very closed down. If they're starting to feel better, have more energy, have less fatigue, have less pain, all those types of things, then it starts to open the door to all these other things they could do, which is why I think that we also can't separate physical health from mental, emotional, or even societal health. Because, there are certain things that happen within our society that also tend to limit people, whether that be from prejudice versus privilege, whether that be, socioeconomic status, which we all know has a massive role to play in health as well. There's a lot of factors there that are really playing towards helping someone to either be where they want to be or not.
I guess this leads me to a next interesting question that I guess is important to sort of recognize, but it's hard to recognize when it comes to distinguishing between what real biofeedback is versus conditioned dieting behavior. And thinking, well, you feel better doing low carb because someone has like a past diet identity that worked for them before, but doesn't necessarily mean like they actually feel truly better. And when you think about biofeedback, what is for you, what does that mean to you? Like, what is biofeedback for you and how would you measure it? I know that part of that is quite subjective, but that
Mm.
subjective data can be still very valuable, especially
Oh, yeah.
especially when you're trying to understand better the path of someone that starts from, as you mentioned, from a 3 to 4 feeling great. So it's not feeling that great when they are at 3 to 4, but you can actually measure that 3 months later, and then you see that they are reporting 7, 8, 9, 10. And the same with that could be other parts of that biofeedback that may not necessarily be just feeling well overall, but maybe is just looking into more specific parts of that biofeedback: sleep, energy,
Mm.
mood, cravings, hunger, fatigue, sleep. So maybe if you could define for me what biofeedback means to you and what areas of biofeedback do you like investigating or discussing with your clients?
Yeah, I guess in terms of, biofeedback, depending on someone's area, is going to mean different things. Sometimes in the physical movement sciences would use sort of biofeedback as a sort of in the moment type marker of something that's happening within the body, transversus abdominis activation or something like that. Whereas in the broader sense, biofeedback can simply be any of those things any of those measures that we're getting to help us then course correct, and adjust and continue to achieve results. So in that broader sense, I think you make a really good point because, I do look a lot at blood markers. I will, because I work a lot with patients who have intractable medical conditions. They've often been bounced around between practitioners and not really got great results. I work a lot with intractable autoimmune conditions, people with, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. And so looking at some of those real blood or other markers is going to be important because that's going to give us a very good snapshot of where their health is overall. And I tend to look at very credible, proven measures for that. I'm not really one of these functional medicine people who, looks at all sorts of weird and wonderful tests because in most cases I find them to be extremely lacking in evidence basis. But again, you make a really good point because that's the starting point. And then we also need to look at other things that are somewhat more biased according to the temporal nature of where the person's at, what they're doing, how they're feeling day to day, other influences, but that's okay, right? And so then we're running through sort of semi-quantitative measures like things you mentioned. How do they feel? How do they rate their energy on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale? How well are they sleeping? How do they feel that their stress is impacting them? How do they feel that they are rewarded or appreciated at work? Because the work to reward ratio is probably more important than work volume when it comes to stress. So there are things like that we can start to quantify. And then there is the more just qualitative expressions that people will give us. And I think that's really important. We did qualitative research embedded with a lot of the stuff that I did for my master's and PhD. In many respects, although it's weaker methodologically, in some cases it's just as important or even more important. I've discussed this with many other scientists because we've sort of discussed this idea of the value of qualitative. And I'll always go back to the point that, okay, but let's say we have diet A and diet B. They perform exactly the same. People get exactly the same results. If we don't ask any further questions, we're going to assume that they're just equally valid. But let's say we ask people how they enjoyed the diets, and almost everyone on diet A said, look, that diet sucked. I hated it. And everyone on diet B said, yeah, that diet was awesome. I felt like I could stick to it. It was easy. I felt good. They haven't given us any quantitative data, but we know it's a better diet intervention, right? So getting that impression from people is really important. One thing that comes into that, which I'll just throw in there because I think it's super interesting, is you see a lot of people who switch to diets, let's say vegan diet, carnivore diet, whatever, and for the first weeks or months, they are just crazy about it. It's like, this is the best thing ever. I feel so good. I didn't know life could be this good. That pretty much happens with any diet.
Mm.
As soon as people change and as soon as people take some ownership over their health, pretty much irrespective of what the diet is, they're probably going to feel great for a few weeks. So I think we all need to be aware of that because the new convert zealot is the loudest voice in the room, usually.
It is. And sometimes that decision gets driven by someone else's influences on that particular person. So, like, if my best friend, good results with a keto diet, maybe that's the diet that I should follow. So people kind of like try to implement the same diets and they try to believe like that's the right thing. And sometimes it just gets even more potentiated by the results that they initially see on the scale. Like, yes, this is the shit. This is the one thing that I should
Yeah.
be following. But when they realize how many things they take from their actual diet and they start missing certain things, or sometimes they have that complete full all or nothing thinking, that there are
Yeah.
good foods and there are foods that you have to definitely take and remove from your diet forever, otherwise you never will get results, is when things start becoming a little bit more trickier. And
Mm.
when a diet trend or a specific diet style becomes more unsustainable because it's no longer fun anymore. It's like
Yeah.
I am missing social events, or I have to completely avoid X, Y, or Z because they are not in the diet. And because they're not in the diet, if I do eat it, I feel like shit or I feel guilty about it. So that could make someone, instead of really trying to have a balanced nutrition and also optimize their emotional relationship with food and the relationship with their nutrition, makes a disjointed relationship where there's gonna always, oh, not maybe not always, but maybe 99% of the times, there's gonna be a backlash from that restriction of not being able to have something that you wanted at the time. And then that's where we see more people having binge eating episodes and restrictive eating reactions to specific diets, or someone who just struggles with their relationship with food because they thought they had to do exactly what a diet rule meant for them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is one of the issues with any diet that becomes, I think this is one of the issues with any diet that becomes, almost religious in
Mm-hmm.
its zealotry, right? It becomes very dogmatic. That's the danger because it's automatically going to invite us versus them. It's automatically going to invite, these are good foods versus these are bad foods. And it causes people who should know better to ignore the relevant research. And so then you have a whole bunch of people following them who are not even aware of the other research because most people, they're not researchers. They're not able to perform even the perfunctory research of going and looking at papers and understanding them. And so they are relying on that appeal to authority fallacy. And so you get these big voices saying this or that. And this is why we have so much divisiveness about diet online. Now, it's an interesting area for me to be in because I'd like to think that if I'm known for anything, it's about being a pragmatic voice in in the middle of the diet wars. But I'll get some of the biggest criticism I get is from your carnivore and hardcore keto advocates who are so outraged that I will dare say that, hey, a lot of people out there get really great results from very high carb diets. And at the end of the day, like I said very early on, if protein, essential fatty acids, and micronutrients are equated, there is often, for most people, most of the time, very little difference between their outcomes depending on how they distribute their carbs or fat. Especially if we're talking about general population, with the exception of athletes who will obviously need higher intakes of carbohydrate, whether they follow low, moderate, or high carb, for most people, it's relatively unimportant. And this was the whole idea behind, the carbohydrate appropriate diet that I sort of started to play around with back in the 90s and coined the term and all that kind of stuff. It was seen as being very peculiar, whereas now I would say that that's more the norm than the exception. So many of my colleagues in clinical nutrition, sports nutrition, they'll take a similar sort of approach where they will allocate protein first, make sure someone's having a nutrient dense diet, and then kind of let the carbs and fat figure itself out to some degree, unless there's a specific requirement for that person to have X amount of carbohydrate because they're an athlete requiring that.
I'm interested to hear a bit more about what is your definition of low, moderate, and high carb? How do we define this, especially because I've seen it in the literature, but it's a little bit all over the place. It doesn't seem that there is a consensus around these definitions. But for you, how would you define what is a low carb, balanced, medium, moderate carb, and high carb?
It's a tough question to answer because, as you said, there are some definitions from the literature, but they're not particularly useful, I don't think. We've got the older definitions that basically classify any intake of carbohydrate under 45% of calories as being a low or lower carb diet. Then you have a lot of positions from, say, the lower carb area of research where they will set arbitrary gram amounts for, say, a keto or low carb diet. So they'll say, well, you should have under 50 grams of carbs per day for a keto diet, under 100 or 150 for a low carb diet, etc. Now, I don't really think any of that is all that illustrative, because if we just take ketosis as an example, different people will achieve ketosis on quite vastly differing amounts of carbohydrate. And, we were the first group that really investigated that. And I've always gone towards the idea that the starting point should be a percentage of calories from carbohydrate rather than a set gram amount. Because if you're saying, 50 grams of carbohydrate, but the person is only having 2,000 calories a day, we're only talking about 200 calories. That's 10% of their diet. If we're talking about someone taking in 4,000 calories per day because they're active, maybe they're an ultra endurance athlete, something like that, it's obviously a much lower proportion. But what we tend to see, and what our research showed, is that people under about 10% of calories from carbohydrate pretty much all achieve ketosis very easily. Some people, and I say under 10%, people might look at the paper and say, hey, but you allocated 5%, but people didn't achieve 5%. On average, they were achieving around 8, just over 8%. So we sort of assume somewhere under 10% people pretty much achieve ketosis all the time. We found that a lot of people on 15% of calories achieved ketosis, and even some people on 25% of calories achieve ketosis. So I think that a lot of the definitions people use are somewhat unimportant. People should instead find strategies and tactics that allow them to adhere to a good diet overall, that allows them to get in enough protein, EFAs, micros, enough vegetable matter. I'm a big fan of vegetables, some berries and fruit and all that kind of good stuff. Even though people say, hey, well, you're supposed to be a keto guy. It's like, yeah, but eat lots of vegetables. And then adjust from there. We don't need to have firm definitions of what low carb is, as if people need to stick to that, because the variability between people is so great that it doesn't really tell us much in terms of what their body's going to be doing, nor is it going to give us any real solid, even indication of what type of results they're going to get necessarily. Now, the exception might be if in clinical practice we have someone who will benefit from a keto diet for specific things, particularly seizure disorders. And I have, clients, for example, with seizure disorders that have a range of other comorbidities that are also going to be benefited by a keto diet. And in that case, yes, we need to achieve ketosis. And we would probably want to achieve a slightly higher level of ketosis than I would normally even suggest, but still not necessarily to the extreme. There's a lot of movement now in this sort of keto for cancer space. I think that's really risky because people don't really understand the role of ketosis as it pertains to cancer. So anyway, that's all a bit of a digression. I guess the main thing is that everyone has a different capacity for producing ketones. They have different capacities for their relative allocation of fat versus carbohydrate in terms of what they're using for fuel. And so a lot of the arbitrary definitions out there just really don't make sense. But if we were to define them in a research setting, I think a percentage of calories is a better way to do it than absolute gram amounts.
So just a follow-up from that. Would you make a specific statement around the definition? Like if you were to define yourself moderate carbohydrate, high carbohydrate, and low carb diet, you mentioned about 10% for low carb, but what would it be for high carb and moderate?
Good question. I would probably say that in general, the general blanket of low carb, I would say would be under 25%. I would say moderate would be under 45%, and high would be over 45% calories from carbohydrate.
Okay. Now, with so much confusion around carbohydrates and insulin, how can we educate more people without overwhelming them with biochemistry?
It comes down, I think, to people understanding the slight nuance, but it's not technical, the slight nuance within energy balance. Because this seems to be one of the biggest debates people have is about the idea of calories in, calories out. And we all know the people on the low carb side who say it's not about calories, it's about carbohydrate. It is about calories. That's clear from the research. And it's just simple thermodynamics. We can't subvert the first law of thermodynamics, right? But there is an extra layer there because people are also a little bit correct when they say that, it's not calories in, calories out. It is, but that's not very useful for people. I think the more useful thing is, okay, let's take it as written because it's an immutable truth that if we take in more energy than we expend, our mass will go up. If we take in less energy than we expend, our mass will go down. That's a law of physics. We're going to leave that one as it is. But the more important thing functionally in terms of applying diet is how do we achieve an appropriate energy balance? And yes, we could track calories. And that works for some people. And it works for actually probably a lot of people for a very short period of time, but it's not always sustainable for most people. So I talk a lot about auto-regulation of energy intake and how do we use dietary and lifestyle levers to auto-regulate our energy intake. Now, within that, we also need to talk a little bit about substrate endpoints, because if we're having a higher proportion of protein in our diet, we will gain probably less fat in a hypercaloric situation, and we will, lose more fat and retain more muscle in a hypocaloric situation. So substrate endpoints are really important. In terms of the relative distribution of carbs versus fat, I don't think it actually matters. One thing that hasn't been studied, which we're going to be studying this year, is hypercaloric strict ketogenic diets to see if there is anything going on there. My hypothesis is that it doesn't really matter. And I think that's what the evidence has shown in all previous studies. But no one's really looked specifically at keto. But anyway, substrate endpoints are important. But if we then move beyond that, how does someone day to day achieve an appropriate energy balance? What are the levers they can use? And a lot of times it comes down to very basic things. Overall, let's have a general focus. And people understand general focus points. This is why I think diets like paleo have been quite successful for a lot of people. Not because it's a uniquely beneficial diet, and not because that's even necessarily what paleo people ate. There was extreme variability in what people in the Paleolithic era ate. It's more so that it provides a philosophy of eating. It's sort of that idea that if I can see it in the forest, I can eat it. What is that really doing for the person? It's probably eliminating a lot of ultra-processed, refined foods that are highly palatable and that don't drive a lot of satiety. So if we're eating more whole, unprocessed foods where possible, increasing vegetable intake, prioritizing protein at meals. Those are key things that are going to help us to auto-regulate our energy. If we're also getting better sleep, we're less likely in the following days to have snacking behaviors. We're less likely to choose ultra-processed and sugary foods. The evidence is clear on that as well. If we're less stressed, for many of us, not all, some people lose weight when they're stressed, but some people also stress eat, right? All those things start to work towards being able to auto-regulate energy intake. Sometimes things like meal frequency. You've got people out there who say, you've got to fast because it'll wave some sort of autophagic wand over your body and you'll be perfect. Of course, that's bullshit, right? You'll have other people who say, don't fast, especially if you're a woman, because it'll destroy your hormonal balance and it'll drive cortisol and all this kind of stuff, which is also bullshit. What's the key thing there is that fasting is a useful tool for some people to auto-regulate energy. It typically drives down overall energy intake because people don't compensate as much within their feeding window. So that can be a really good tool if someone tends towards overeating. However, that may not be a good tool if someone tends towards undereating, because then they might drive that down a little bit more. So I think if we're looking more so at that baseline of, yes, energy intake is critically important, where we get that energy from is also important because that's going to really affect body composition. Then what tactics can we use to help preserve an appropriate energy balance without having to always be tracking calories and macros?
I agree. And I would like for you to perhaps do a bit of a distinction between that concept that you're mentioning about auto-regulation with your diet, which sounds similar, but I don't think it is the same thing as when people refer to just eating intuitively. Or maybe for you it's the same. What is your stance on those two concepts, whether you find a difference or not?
Yeah, I think auto-regulation is more something that occurs because of the other tactics we've put in place. So we're putting in place structures that allow us then to have relative freedom and flexibility within our diet. But
Yep.
there are still structures there. And, you know, with one exception, with those approaches like intuitive eating, health at every size, and whatnot, we tend to see very good psychological outcomes and emotional outcomes, but we tend to not actually see great physical outcomes over years when they do follow up. So people's metabolic health tends to decline, continue to decline, right? And that's because I believe there's not enough structure around various tactics, which basically then just become habits. But we still need both. We still need freedom within structure. Because if it's just, a matter of I'm going to eat what I want in the moment, I think that's
Mm,
great for freedom, but you still have to have some structures backing it up to allow it to be a system that actually works. I know that if I just have a whole bunch of chocolate in the house, I will probably eat it. So a
yep.
good tactic is to not have it here. I'm not saying that I can't have it, but I'm changing my environment so that it's not as easy to do. If I want to have that chocolate, I've got to walk down the road, I've got to buy it, I've got to make a conscious decision to put in all that action to actually get it. And if I still want it, I'm going to go get it. Great. To me, that's freedom within the structure that allows for health outcomes. So I think the two things are aligned, but subtly different because, the freedom absolutists out there will find themselves incredibly limited because it's just not a thing that can happen in the real world. And I think about it in the terms of training as well. You're obviously an athlete. We work a lot with athletes. I've been an athlete and have succeeded in my particular sport. There's no way that I could have succeeded in my sport if I was just training intuitively. Oh,
Mm.
I've got cleans and snatches planned today, but I'm just going to go in and do some curls. Like, there's no way you're going to win a weightlifting competition if you're just doing whatever you feel like on the day.
I totally agree. And I think going or adding a little bit more to that concept that you explained of a structured flexibility is that when you think about intuitive eating, probably to get to a level that you can actually make good decisions on your own with your intuition, it has to be based on experience and getting to a level of a skill that you actually know what you're actually doing. So, for example, if you have no idea of what's in your food, what the nutrition composition of food, what are some good protein sources, what is a good source of fiber, these kind of things that are just the basics of nutrition that are like a basic knowledge for you to just go ahead and make adequate food choices and food decisions. How would you make those decisions if you have no fucking clue what's in your food to begin with? So I think
Yep.
to me, intuitive eating can be helpful and successful for someone who has already acquired the skill of knowing what's in their eating, in their plan, in their nutrition, and how to actually regulate these with certain rules, like you said, or certain boundaries that allow you to have some amount of a structure. Okay, I need
Yeah.
to have perhaps if I'm not going to necessarily track my nutrition, I definitely can see myself eating every time I eat something, I'm going to have vegetables in it and I'm going to have protein in it. So there is always like a certain rule or direction that is still giving me some structure. Okay, I'm not missing on protein. I'm getting adequate amount of fiber, or I am just doing the things that have to be aligned with a nutrition and healthful eating.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's really important that people need to have just a modicum of knowledge of even simple things like you were sort of alluding to, like what I call a modular approach to meal planning. It's an approach I use for a lot of my clients because it's simple. It's really just about breaking down what I've worked out in the background as their energy and macro requirements, but into portion sizes for them, and then having them just focus on key things. Like at a meal, for example, it might be two palm sizes of a protein portion, at least two fist sizes of vegetables, and then, carbohydrate allocated according to their activity and their psychosocial stuff, all that kind of thing. So having some key tactics like that or learnings like that is really important. Also underpinning it, I mentioned before that there is one exception to that whole sort of non-diet approach to nutrition that actually works based on the evidence, and that's mindfulness, right? But most people aren't mindful, aware, present in and of the moment enough to, I think, really make the best choices for themselves completely intuitively. Now, again, last year at last year's Sports Nutrition Association conference, Dr. Joe Klimczewski, who you probably know of, the diet doc, the creator of the idea of flexible dieting, he gave a really good talk, and he brought up these points about, these non-diet approaches actually not working that effectively, especially for fat loss. And I talked with Joe about this afterwards, and I said, there's one that actually works, and it's mindfulness. And when studies have compared people on diet interventions versus those on meditation and mindfulness programs, often the people on the meditation and mindfulness programs actually do better with respect to improving their health markers. Probably because then they're not falling so much victim to those other influences that we've discussed today, like stress, work to reward ratio, sleep, eating for other reasons other than being hungry. But I don't think you need to exclude one for the other. I think if people can be more mindful and aware and also have some key points that they understand about their structure of nutrition, that's all going to move towards helping someone be free of their restraints around nutrition. Although I have structures for my daily diet, I don't feel constrained by them at all because they're just habits at this point. I get up every morning and I have the same thing every morning. I have the same shake after training. I eat roughly the same types of things, although the exact foods will change for lunch and dinner, and it works. And my partner and I typically have a big treat meal on a Friday night. And we love doing that. And we don't feel like we're binging, because to binge means there has to be a psychological consequence.
Something that I really want you to speak about, and it's been very, very controversial lately, is this old concept of net carbs versus total carbohydrates, and how do we pay attention to this concept when it comes to understanding the nutrition composition and the nutritional value, especially talking about calories when someone is tracking the nutrition, and how misleading or confusing could be when we look at different labels from different countries, and the same food could be exactly the same, and one that accounts for the total carbohydrates, including net carbohydrates, fiber, whatever, it's giving you a number that completely opposes the number the same from the same product coming from another place that completely subtracts the net carbs and only accounts for those carbohydrates that are actually in the food without the fiber. How do we define and how do we make a final verdict on what is truly important about these two different things?
I think people should always be looking at net carbs, because the total carbs are quite unimportant unless we're obviously wanting to get our fiber intake up. And so, getting more fiber and resistant starch is great. I think that's only a positive thing, but we certainly shouldn't look at it as a large contributor to our caloric load. Now, some people will say, yeah, but they do contribute to caloric load by virtue of being converted by, bacteria in the gut and the microbiota to, like, butyrate, for example, butyric acid, which can, reach systemic circulation or can, go via the hepatic portal vein to the liver to be converted to ketones, etc. But the overall impact of that is very, very minimal, because most of those short-chain fatty acids that are produced are used within the intestinal epithelium. So they're used by other bacteria, they're used by the intestinal epithelial cells themselves, And so, is there going to be some impact? Yes, but it's not really a meaningful impact, especially when we consider that within the foods we already eat, there's variability anyway, because different foods will obviously have a different thermic effect. Different fats will actually have a different caloric value. Like if you're taking in short chain fats, they have fewer calories, but only marginally, than medium chain fats, which have fewer calories than long chain fats, although it's a marginal difference, right? There's enough marginal differences within our food that I don't think we should worry about it. We should instead focus on the big stuff, get ourselves on a baseline. Don't worry about total carbs, worry about net carbs if you are carb counting. And then once you have a baseline, you can adjust from there. I'll often have students say, well, what if the person is not eating exactly what I've put in the plan? I usually say, well, don't worry about it, even if they are tracking, because there are gonna be flaws within their tracking. There are gonna be flaws within their reporting and the way they report. But what you can do is you can set a baseline, and if you've set a baseline and it's 1,800 calories, and they're not eating that every day, that doesn't matter. What they are eating will average out over time, and you'll see whether they're getting results. And if they're not getting results, you can then shift it. Now, it might be that they're eating 2,200 calories on average a day, and you've got them on 1,800, and then you reduce it because they're not losing any body fat down to 1,600. They're going then from 2,200 to 2,000, right? It doesn't actually matter so much what they're doing, it's the application into the outcome. And that's a really interesting thing when we're looking at research, because often I have to discuss this with my students, that when we provide a diet intervention in the real world, in other words, we're not doing a metabolic ward study, we're not actually studying the effect of that diet on outcomes. We're studying the effect of the application of that diet in the real world to outcomes. And so I alluded to it before when I said, hey, we had people on a 5% calories from carbohydrate diet. They didn't actually achieve 5%. On average, they were at 8%. Doesn't really matter because they still got results by trying to get to 5%, actually getting to 8%. So we could see nuances too within the application, right? And it's the same thing in clinical practice. What we actually give them, they're never going to do because no one's perfect, but we can set a baseline which we can then shift from.
I agree with you. The only thing that I kind of think about is when obviously it is going to perhaps matter more depending on which athlete we're speaking with, on sort of what is the context of and the reason for tracking every single thing. Like if we think about physique athletes, where we get to a point where getting the leanest as possible is a priority, tracking every single thing perhaps matters as compared to someone who is diabetic, who's trying to improve their health and their nutrition. And if they eat a few more net carbs or a few more extra grams of fiber and adds extra calories, it's not a really big deal. So when it comes to looking at specific groups of athletes that really need to narrow down their caloric value and be very precise, because everything counts, especially when you think about someone who have to go as far as 1,200 calories for several weeks. Like if you're mistracking something, that could potentially be the one thing that is delaying or affecting that total daily energy intake. But as far as being precise and make something effective, you alluded to that there's always errors and there's always parts in the tracking that is never accurate 100%. But what is your approach when it comes to that specific, I guess, population of athletes who need to be very, very precise with their tracking?
It's a good point. And, I would say first up that nowadays I don't work with bodybuilders. I don't work with physique athletes, although I did a lot in the past. So I had Natural Olympia champs, Muscle Mania champs, all sorts of top physique athletes. And I agree with you 100%. I think it's a matter of needs must. And as you said, your general population, even if they want to track and, they will benefit from that for a time at least, especially for just their own education around what's in food, they don't need to be anywhere near as precise. But then for a top level athlete, they probably need to be more precise. For a physique athlete, absolutely, they should try and be as precise as they can be. But as you also said, there is still going to be some mistakes in reporting there. Maybe they choose the wrong food from the database. Maybe it doesn't, and obviously there's going to be variability anyway, because even if you're getting it as precise as you can be, you've got a steak that is from a particular area, you've put that into your tracking, you've weighed it to the gram, you've done everything. There's still going to be variability in protein, intramuscular fats, even some things depending on how long you cook it within meat-derived fibers, which are a thing. There's going to be differences in intramuscular glycogen content, and the availability of that, depending on how long it's cooked, all that kind of stuff. So there's always going to be variability anyway, but I agree with you 100%, needs must. So for an athlete who is going to get on stage in their undies, they need to be as precise as they can possibly be. And that gives us then the best opportunity to adjust as needed without there being, big, particularly between day variability. I talked about averages. You kind of need to average these things over days because there is going to be some variability, but you want that variability to be as little as possible for someone who needs to be in that, specific physique shape. And to some degree, that also plays into those athletes that I have who need to make weight, for maybe the Olympics as a wrestler. That's also very fine when you're working with that nth degree of weight cutting, and it's very much on the cusp of whether they're going to be able to do it or not. So I agree. I actually agree with you 100%.
So in this case, would you be considering to track total carbs or still on the position of, say, sticking with the net carbs?
I would still track the net carbs because if you're tracking total carbs and let's say someone is having foods that have, you might have two foods which have the same total carbs, one has fewer net carbs, it's going to have less caloric impact than that food that has more net carbs and less fiber. So I think in terms of making it as precise as possible, I would still be looking to track net carbs. I can understand why people might make a case for also tracking fiber intake, but I think then we are getting into the minutiae that is actually not going to be all that important because there's so much variability throughout other things anyway. Like, for example, if someone is having, MCTs as compared to a long chain fat, are we going to take into account that the MCTs have around 8 calories per gram versus the long chain fat having 9 calories per gram? Like, probably not. We're just going to let it sort of ride out. And that small variation is not going to make that much of an impact over time. But, that's just my approach. And I understand that different people have different ways to track and different approaches they want to take. Like I say as well, it's not so much of an important thing for me nowadays because with the exception of, athletes that are making weight, I don't work with physique athletes anymore, thankfully.
I guess my
I,
point,
I pass them off to Eric and those guys,
yeah, no, I guess my point probably makes more sense when you think about someone who is eating the same food several times a day. So it's not just one off, but like
Yeah.
the same food is eaten at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. And this is potentially not applicable for everyone, but let's just talk about these low carb tortillas. They can be very, very tasty and very handy. And perhaps someone who likes to have a limited amount of certain food choices for carbohydrates, they decide that is one of their food staples. And they pretty much have it with breakfast, with lunch, with dinner, and they enjoy it so much that even a snack could have some of that specific tortilla. So if you're mistracking it once, that's fine because you're just eating it once a day. But if it's someone who is not just doing it one time, but across the day several times, maybe the margin of error and the discrepancy between the amount of calories they're taking it becomes a little bit larger and more significant. So what would you think about in this scenario?
It's a really good point. I still don't take it into account because even if the number, especially if they're being consistent with particular food choices, the number they're taking in is less important than the outcomes they're getting. And where we're tracking very fastidiously, like let's say it is a physique athlete or one of my athletes making weight for a big international competition, then I'll be in contact with them so frequently, we'll soon see if any of those measures, body fat, their qualitative or semi-quantitative measures like their sleep, their, perceived stress response, those types of things, we'll see where those are not quite right. So again, it's not necessarily so much about exactly what they're doing, it's whether the plan as they're applying it is meeting their results, and we can then shift within that. But I take your point, it's a really good one, and I will, it's given me food for thought. It's a really interesting one. I just feel like when we're talking about just, the straight calorific impact of fiber, for example, I think we're talking about something that is potentially so small and so variable that it's really going to be difficult to quantify. And I think as compared to the impact of the things we know are actually going into systemic circulation and being used for their energy, like their net carbs, it probably actually promotes more potential variability when we're tracking, say, the calories from fiber or resistant starch than not, because how much they're taking up, really unclear, because we don't know how much their intestinal epithelium is taking up. We don't know how much is being metabolized by bacteria within the gut versus uptaken. It might depend a little bit too on what type of diet they're on. Some people have said, "Oh, why don't you track total carbs? They're going to reduce ketogenesis if someone's trying to be in ketosis." I say, well, do they really? Because we know from the evidence that butyrate is more ketogenic than even MCTs. So if someone is producing that little bit of butyrate, which is then potentially entering the hepatic portal vein, liver, ketone production, then that might be of benefit to them. So yeah, I think there's too much variability in there. But you bring up a really good point, Astrid. I'm going to be thinking about that while I'm on the plane today.
That's awesome. Well, my last point, and I respect your time and thank you so much for answering all my questions, is going to be about what are some of the things that you feel like, let me reframe. What's one belief you held perhaps 10 years ago that you've completely changed your mind about when it comes to nutrition and training?
Gee, that's a really good question. I think in nutrition, it's probably, and this maybe goes back a little bit more than 10 years, but I'd say 10, maybe 15 years ago, I was probably of the opinion that, keto is best for fat loss. And now I think that it's just so much more nuanced. I think even if despite the Diet Fit study, I think there are a lot of reasons why we wouldn't necessarily include that in the compendium of research on this. I think there's enough to suggest that different people will get different results from higher versus lower carb diets for fat loss. I think that even if there are physiological indicators, which we've looked into in our research, I think that the psychosocial element, really trumps that anyway in terms of what people can actually do. So that would probably be the biggest thing. Is I certainly don't think that keto is the best diet for fat loss. I think it's a valid tool for fat loss, but not for everybody. And a lot of people will obviously achieve better fat loss for lots of different reasons on a higher carb approach. So that's probably the biggest one in nutrition that I can think of. In terms of training, that's a really good question, because I think that one thing that's shifted for me is a lot of the rigidity, and this again probably goes back a little bit more than 10 years, but the rigidity around the right way to train. And I think in terms of exercise selection, I've always been fairly broad and haven't really bought into the idea that certain exercises are bad or dangerous or anything like that, because I'm an all-round weightlifter. So, we have a compendium of over 140 recognized competition lifts that we choose for our competition. So I've always been into a whole variety of strength lifts. But I think, being somewhat indoctrinated through the 90s and 2000s into you must perform a deadlift this way, set scapula, all that kind of stuff, very rigid. I don't think that's necessarily helpful all the time. So I think I've probably become a lot freer and more flexible, to excuse the pun, around a lot of the performance of different lifts, depending on what someone's goals are, their body type, what they're trying to achieve. So I'd say in training, it's just a lot more forgiving of the different things that people do. And I think that plays into a lot of the methodology we use, because again, it goes back to a point that we discussed very early on. A lot of people will say very absolutist things. I see it all the time online, where you must do X amount of sets to grow. You must be within X amount of reps in reserve to gain strength or to grow. You must do these exercises in order to gain strength. It's all rubbish because there are so many different ways to achieve, and there is probably only one key element, really, especially for strength development, which is that you see your numbers going up. If your numbers are going up, you're stronger. It's that simple. And if you get there on 1 set a week or 30 sets a week, hey, it's kind of working for you. Now, people will also say, oh, but if you had have done this, you would have achieved better. Possibly, but maybe not. People said that about Michael Phelps when he was busted for smoking pot. Like, people said, oh, imagine how many more gold medals he would have won if he hadn't smoked pot. It's like, that's just a complete ambiguous and unquantifiable thing to say. No one could ever know. Maybe he was better because he had the odd puff and it, relaxed them.
That's very true. And it probably is similar but different when it comes to differentiating training for strength versus hypertrophy. I think
Big time.
even hypertrophy is even more forgiving because you can literally just choose whichever exercise feels best and there's better mind muscle connection. You don't necessarily have to put specific exercises in specific order, as long as you hit a certain volume and you're training with certain intensity, close to failure with intention, with the right form, mechanical tension. Like, you gotta put all these things together, but the rigidity and the structure is not as important as perhaps a few years ago one would think that there was.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there are obviously exceptions. The more elite someone is, maybe the more dialed in they need to be, but we
Yeah.
still see massive variability, right? When you look at powerlifters who train 2 to 3 hours a day, 6 days a week versus, someone like a Mark Chalet who trained twice a week, there's still massive variability. But for most people who are Gen Pop, recreational athletes, maybe not at the elite end, even if they are competing, it doesn't matter as much. And I think one of the things that we need to be very wary of doing is putting in place too many obstacles to people just having fun with their training.
Mm.
Like, that's one thing I loved when I got into all-round weightlifting. I chatted with, he's passed away now, sadly, a good friend of mine, Steve Angel, who's considered one of the strongest men to have ever lived. We were chatting about when we got into all-round weightlifting, what it felt like because it was a minority sport. At the time, there wasn't much internet around, so, you couldn't just jump online and find out about things. You basically found out by being in the gym around people and just having fun with lifts. It was like the old days back of, Arthur Saxon playing with a barbell and just seeing what he could do. It was very much like that. And we didn't feel limited because we were just picking up heavy stuff and doing things with it, snatching it, cleaning it, one hand, two hand lifts, all sorts, two-person lifts, we're just playing around with things and it was so fun. And you can easily lose that fun when people tell you, no, that's the wrong way to do it, or that's the wrong thing to do, or you need to do it in this order. So yeah, let people have some fun with their bloody training as well. It's got to be fun, otherwise what's the point?
It has to. It has to. Like, to me, that's one of the biggest things. I find so much joy when I train that even when I was doing my prep, I got to a point where, like, I am not finding this fun anymore. And that was hard for me because it was like, I am coming to the gym with no motivation anymore. I'm so tired. I'm so hungry. And this has become such a chore because I still have to do it. I still have to kind of like continue to show up, but the fun was not there anymore until I
Yeah.
finished my show and I had a good refeed, and then I went with energy and like finally I'm fucking training with back with life. So that was a big thing. But
Yeah.
to me, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Cliff. Where can people find you? Is there any future projects you have coming up for you?
Yeah, so most of what I do is through my institute. I own and run a post-tertiary education institute that trains people to be health coaches, sports nutritionists, and clinical nutritionists, all, with registrable opportunities when they graduate. So they can register, for example, as a clinical nutritionist. And that's just called the Holistic Performance Institute. So people can find that at holisticperformance.institute.
Awesome. Well, Cliff, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. I appreciate you, and I am looking forward to talk to you and another time. There's still a lot of things that I want to talk to you, so hopefully we can make it in the second round and have a further chat about things. You have a wealth of knowledge that is worth digging into.
Thanks, Astrid. It's been a lot of fun. So anytime you want to chat, just let me know.
Awesome. All right. Have a beautiful day, and I'll talk to you very soon.